Hi folks, with Tacitus Today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining us audio live stream. A bit of a departure, I guess, from usual commentary. I'm going to go off into a sidebar of history. I'm actually a serious history buff, so I do like talking about these things, but typically stay with, as my listeners will be well aware, stay more with the politics and the social commentary. Just on, this is an essay about General De Gaulle, General Charles De Gaulle, the World War II, French government in exile in effect, and later Prime Minister of France, and then served as president for I think about 10 years, 9 or 10 years in the 1960s, at a time when the Fourth Republic of France was maybe needing a strong man to try and stabilise things, someone who's perceived as being beyond or outside of the petty levels of the political discourse of the time, in French terms at least. And I think in generally he's certainly a figure of history that's worthy of recognition. I'm rereading a book that I got a few years ago, and I was already sort of reading a lot about, or had read a lot about, General de Gaulle, given his role in World War II and then in his role in Europe thereafter. But this book is called The Last Great Frenchman. It's about Charles de Gaulle, and it's written by a British historian called Charles Williams. And if anyone's looking at maybe understanding more about de Gaulle and those times during the war and subsequently, I can recommend this book. So The Last Great Frenchman, by the author Charles Williams. Now I'm using that as a base reference, but I've read other biographies and so on, and histories as well. I'll give you just a little bit of quick background. De Gaulle was like a young lieutenant or a captain in World War One. So he was born sort of in the I think in the 1890s, and at a time when France was still a great nation, or at least had sort of reasonable pretensions to that. They had an empire in North Africa, an empire in what today is Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos, and various other possessions around the world, Tahiti and so on and so forth. So they were still a formidable world power with, I think they'd have been the fourth or fifth largest economy in the world at the time, and were considered to be, as a hangover from the days of Louis XIV and Napoleon Bonaparte, were considered to still have a very formidable military machine at their disposal. So now, so Charles de Gaulle was a child of empire, and he sort of had this idea from childhood and a Jesuit education that France was a great power, a great world power, and deserved to be treated as a power of the first rank, which was already being a little ambitious at the time, given the rise of Germany and the United States and Britain's very substantial mercantile lead over the French. But nonetheless, so de Gaulle's a young officer in World War One. He gets captured and he's imprisoned for quite some time. Then he's well thought of in some quarters during the interwar years between World War One and World War Two, and he's interestingly one of the few military thinkers of the time, and he even wrote some papers where he realised the value of using concentrated armour, that is, tanks, divisions and brigades of tanks, to achieve decisive breakthroughs in the front line and to exploit breakthrough opportunities, these sorts of things. He was one of the few that saw that, and again wrote some papers on it. Didn't really get much of a response from the French generals, who were still fixated with fighting the last war, rather than looking at how technology had changed and was changing, and how that changing technology would create a different type of warfare. Now, it's interesting, given all the World War II combatants, the Americans, the Russians, the British, the French, nobody really saw the potential. There were some people that thought about it, General Hobart and Fuller and Britain and De Gaulle and a couple of other, but they were more sort of at major or colonel type level rather than senior level guys that had written papers and put forward discussions about the use of tanks. And anyway, De Gaulle was one of those, and that kind of separated him, I think, a bit from the pack there. Interestingly, in Germany, there was again generals like Guderian and others that saw the potential for mass tanks to achieve decisive breakthroughs, coupled with use of strategic bombing and these sorts of things. And so they whereas none of the others get anywhere, these guys were able to put their ideas to a new chancellor, a new prime minister of Germany, and say, look, we got these ideas. What do you think? And he's the top man, so he's I think that's really got potential. Put it together and show me some demonstration. Let's see. But I see that. And that prime minister was Adolf Hitler. He was the only one that saw that potential of the massed armour and to use it for decisive strikes. So that's an interesting thing there. So coming back to De Gaulle, though, come 1940, the French and the British and the Dutch and the Belgians are decisively defeated, and very quickly, by the Wehrmacht, the German armed forces, in organisationally and tactically, it's got to be one of the most brilliant military campaigns ever devised. But it was as much a success of German planning and tactics, and again the combined use of tanks and dive bombing and things like that. It was as much as that as it was of piss poor organisation and preparedness on the other side. So now it wasn't that the French and the British didn't have an idea of what was coming, because they could have seen it in the Polish campaign, where the Wehrmacht went into Poland, and that was wrapped up very quickly. And given it was the first time they were really trying it in real time, it was still done with masterful efficiency, as I think any observer would say. And that was refined further in the French attack. So De Gaulle was one of the few officers that led a successful counterattack against the striking German columns of armour, and had some success there. He was made a minister in the government, a junior minister in the government, and was sent to negotiate with the British to organise more help for the French. And the French had already been defeated at that point. There was no real escape. There was Dunkirk, where the British, and I think some 75 or 80,000, I think it was, French soldiers were evacuated to Britain. Now, at this point, the French government collapses, and they capitulate to the Nazis, and they're given, the overall scheme of things, probably acceptable peace terms, and that's the Vichy France came out of this. Now, the British were in a difficult position, because the official government of France, following the surrender to the Germans, is now the Vichy, what's called the Vichy. That's the official government. But they weren't elected, so they haven't been elected by the people. So there's some legal questioning over, well, are they a legitimate government? Are they a puppet government? What are they? Now, in addition to that, there are considerable French territories in Africa and North Africa and elsewhere, where there are French troops with also considerable naval assets that are there, battleships and cruisers and submarines and so on. So The British are keen that those things should not fall into German hands. If the German got their hands on the entire French fleet, that would drastically alter the balance of naval power in the Atlantic, and the British were understandably very, very nervous about that possibility. So de Gaulle's there in England negotiating with the British when this surrender takes place. He pops up and says, well, look, I don't accept that those guys are surrendered. France is a great power. I don't accept this humiliation. I don't accept the cowardly, as de Gaulle would see it, the cowardly terms that were gone into with the Germans through the Vichy government, this surrender and the rolling over and all that sort of stuff. So I'm going to lead the government that is effectively the French government in exile, or the Free French as it was called, but the French government in exile. Now, he's only a brigadier general and relatively newly promoted there. He's a very junior minister in the previous government. But the Churchill and Anthony Eden and the British are sort of hedging their bets here. The Vichy government is almost anti-British, whereas de Gaulle is saying, well, I'll stay in England and I'll make radio broadcasts. I'll represent the Free French, and I'll try and get all these other French colonies and French troops and French naval assets to come over to Britain. And by the way, you've got 70,000 French soldiers or thereabouts in Britain now, so I'll make sure that they're part of the if you like the reforming the French military, so it's ready to recapture France at some future point. So given juggling and balancing all that, the British thought, well, we might as well support this guy. He's in fact the only guy who's stepping up, and we kind of need a French voice to get the French on our side, or as many French on our side as we can. Simply because of all that many tens of thousands of French soldiers in Britain that have been evacuated out of Dunkirk following the collapse of the French army in June, July 1940. So de Gaulle's there, and he's prepared to get on the radio and make I represent France and so on. Now, this was all well and good, and it allowed the British at least to hedge their bets. The Americans were less enthusiastic. They thought they could deal with the Vichy government, keep it neutral in effect, and then win it over gradually through persuasion. That was, Roosevelt's sort of view of the world, the American President Roosevelt, and the view of the American government at the time, John Foster Dulles and so on. So de Gaulle didn't get on well with these. He wanted France to be treated as a world. France is a great power. France is a world power. Is a nation of the first rank, and is deserving of the respect and the dignity of a nation of the first rank. Now, the Americans, not unreasonably, by the way, said, well, hold on a minute. France is not a power of the first rank. Your army was absolutely destroyed by the Germans in 6 weeks and went down like a sack of shit. And so what exactly is it that makes France a country of the first rank? Your army's next to useless. You've surrendered. You're occupied by a foreign, part of France is occupied by a foreign power. So exactly what is it that makes France a country, a power of the first rank? Why do you think you've got some primary negotiating position? Why must you be treated? Now, de Gaulle was insisting on being treated as an equal with Britain, America, and the Soviet Union, which was a ludicrous proposition, by the way. But the dignity of France must be maintained. And so he drove the Churchill and Roosevelt and others, by the way, to distraction by his insistence that de Gaulle, he was France. He represented all of France and all French aspirations in the future, which was the British had him there as a political expediency, not because he represented France or he was going to be he was France or the personification of France. So they played, if you like, a bit of a double game with him. They wanted to keep him on side for the obvious reasons of, again, the French colonies where there were troops stationed in North Africa, for the obvious reasons of, again, the French colonies where there were troops stationed in North Africa and also in the Middle East, Levant, Syria and Lebanon, places like that, and also where the French naval assets, and the British were super nervous about that. So they tolerated de Gaulle for those expediencies rather than they thought he was, they all perceived he was obstinate and difficult, and really didn't bring much to the table other than he was the only guy to step up and say, well, look, I'll represent France, because no one else would at the time. So, when you look at the mere fact De Gaulle was prepared to step up and take on that responsibility and take on that mission, in itself warrants, I think, the status, if not greatness, certainly prominence. And as difficult as he was to get on with, and he was, as difficult as he was to get on with, that still doesn't detract from the fact that he was the only one prepared to step up. And he did have the legitimacy of being a general in the French army and also a junior minister in the previous government. So there was a, if you like, and he was the appointed liaison at the time. I believe, at least, if you look at that in totality, he does have legitimacy as a French representative. He wasn't just some guy who came up from nowhere. He was already in dialogue and discourse with the British government, including Churchill, before the surrender, so French surrender. So again, he has that legitimacy. Now, coming to his life after, I just go back a little bit here. Some of the things I saw a documentary, or a docudrama, I guess you call it. The French take an interesting view. They appreciate the British help during World War II. But quite rightly say that the only thing that saved Britain from invasion and being crushed by the Wehrmacht was the fact that the English Channel, they just couldn't get across the Channel. That was the only thing that saved them. If it wasn't for that, they too would have been gobbled up by the Wehrmacht in very quick time. And that's I think without dispute. Some military theorists today, looking at how things were, say if the Wehrmacht had just been able to parachute in, 20,000 paratroopers, they could have successfully captured London at the time. That the British were in such disarray after Dunkirk that's all the Wehrmacht would needed to have done. I don't know, that's probably a little bit optimistic, but it couldn't be written off, and I don't doubt that possibility could have existed. So the French take the view, even today, that whilst the British help was appreciated, I think the British were just lucky in getting away with it because of the Channel. Don't think you're better than us. Really, you bums would have succumbed to the same fate if it hadn't been for the English Channel. I agree with that. So I think that's a stated fact. Also, the mere fact the British were helping the French and were, if you like, babysitting De Gaulle, that's sort of got some resentment there. Don't think that you're better than us because of that. We're your equals, and don't you forget it, you damn. So there's a certain sort of jealousy, envy, resentment, and a certain sense of trying to overcome the humiliation of such a swift and crushing defeat. And then these, the French having to rely on the good graces of the British to even exist. The British could have shut down De Gaulle at any time they wanted, but they did stay with him throughout, even though there was some blazing rows with him and Churchill, screaming at each other. And so anyway, it turned out. Now, when De Gaulle was in charge of the provisional government after the war ended, and then he went into sort of almost self-imposed exile, and then came back as president of France. Now, France was in a difficult situation in the late 1950s. Everywhere there was agitation in their empire for independence, or at least some level of autonomy equating or approximating independence. Now, this could have been in French Algeria and French North Africa, in Syria and Lebanon, or indeed in Vietnam and so on. The French had been humiliated everywhere. They'd been brushed aside by the Japanese as ineffectual. They'd been crushed by the German war machine. So it's not like France had much to its military glory were in long past. Its days of military glory were Napoleon Bonaparte, and really not a whole lot since then. They'd hung on grimly in World War One, only because of massive British aid. They were unable to fund the war and unable to put enough troops in the field to oppose the German war machine in the First World War. And again, it was only British support that kept them going. And then it was only American support that kept the British going in the last 6 to 9 months of the war. So anyway, the French Empire was disintegrating, and politically or internally, France was all going to shit. The politicians spending more time squabbling than administering the country. The communists were very strong and funded and supported and helped by the Soviet Union. So De Gaulle came back, was invited back in effect as president to rewrite another constitution, or write a new constitution rather, and to provide stability to France. He was realistic enough, as much as he was for the prestige and glory of France, he was realistic enough to know that they couldn't hang on to their empire. And so, Vietnam effectively had already been lost. And again, which was impetus to the activists in French North Africa, Algeria and Morocco and so on. And so he was realistic enough to know that the days of empire were gone, and they could hang on to a few little things like Tahiti and the like, but effectively it was all over. And so it was the transition of France from being a world power into being just a local European power, and already it was being surpassed, quite substantially surpassed, by the German economy. So France was definitely slipping into a status of the power of the second rank. So de Gaulle was there to actually hang on to the trappings of the glory of a France of yesteryear, and that determination that France must be treated with the dignity and respect of a power of the first rank, which it clearly no longer was very much something de Gaulle insisted on. And I think this is seen in hindsight as really the basis for what is presumed to be his greatness. His insistence that France was a great power gave it a certain artificial dignity that wasn't warranted by any reality. And aside from that, I see him as someone that was prepared to take on responsibilities others wouldn't, was prepared to shoulder burdens that others wouldn't. Was he an intellectually brilliant man? No. Was he some sort of a genius or a political backroom operator of the first order? No, I don't think it any of those things. And if you dissect the little individual parts of de Gaulle, in my view at least, there really is not much about him that you could say represented greatness. But I think one thing does stand out: his preparedness to, again, as I've mentioned, to take on those responsibilities, to step up to the plate when it counted and when others wouldn't, and to see it through to the end. His determination, not just to start something or to administer it, but to actually see it through to the conclusion that was some approximation of his vision. Not that he didn't have to make deals on the way he did, but and I think that is what still qualifies him as great. Certainly a man of his times. I'd be interested in seeing your comments below. You've been fantastic today. Your pushback channel. Thank you for listening.